It gives me tremendous pleasure to welcome as our speaker today, Dr. Nicholas Bonneau, who is going to be giving our lecture. And this lecture has been, I think it's fair to say, quite a long time in the planning. So it's fantastic to actually have you here, Nick, and we're really looking forward to your lecture. So Nicholas Bonneau is a historian of many things, science, medicine, the environment, and so on. And his particular interest is the history of pandemics. He's worked on a number of pandemics and other medical emergencies of different kinds over the years. And he's going to talk to us then about the way in which pandemics are remembered and influence society. The title you'll already have seen, A Repression of Things Past, Reflections on the Memory of Pandemics in the Wake of COVID. Thank you very much.
Alrighty, and hello to everybody. So thank you for having me here today. As a historian of public health, disease, and death in North America, it's always a pleasure to bring these stories to new audiences, especially overseas. As I understand, we're also being recorded. There we are. All right. So, as I understand, we're also being recorded, and maybe we're editing as well. I don't know. That would be nice. And that this will be available to students to view on demand, as well as being on YouTube later on. So, just a reminder to you that the ideas presented here are my own point of view, my own intellectual property, and thus they neither reflect the point of view of my host or any of my home institutions. Now, at long last, before we begin, let's try a little experiment. Look at these three items. What might they be? Could they be bacteria stained and presented for biology students at a university? Could they be images of the canopy of a forest full of leaves and light? Or could they be a pathologist's sample of diseased tissues left for identification after the loss of a patient? It's difficult to say at this level of resolution, but they appear to be made up of smaller shapes of some type. Now let's add more data to the first blue example here on the left and see what happens. Well, now we get a sense that this may not be something seen under a microscope, perhaps a work of art, but if it is, can we identify the style, the artist, or even the subject? Of course, if this still eludes us, we will just need more data. So add in a great deal more and a picture emerges, one perhaps recognizable to many here with us today or to those streaming online. As these data come together, we can confirm that all originate from a single intentional work of art. And here it is. There you go. So this is the Pointillist Seurat's 1888, La Seine à la Grande Jetée. So the recovery of pandemics requires a similar approach. I and others like me, we spend our days bringing together thousands of individual records, many fragmentary, in an often quixotic quest to explore past events on their own terms. Of course, we don't always get there, right? The past is indeed a foreign country, and our interpretations often lead us astray. Too often our minds fill in the blanks with what we might wish to see rather than what was there in the past. And although we might wish to regain the resolution of the picture on the left, the fragmentary memory of pandemics is at best something like the picture on the right, a noble but ultimately flawed picture of something much more complex than what we can comprehend, let alone reconstruct. So today we're going to look at the various ways many misinterpret and at times simply miss epidemics of the past and ways we might correct this moving forward in our new pandemic world. So to get things started, I'm going to begin with just a few more points of data, building a story which may challenge the way we think about two diseases, one of which many of you may not have ever heard, although I suspect many will, and another which probably takes up more ink than any other save the plague. Having gained some insight into the prioritizations which make our memory of past diseases so unreliable, we'll turn to the relationship between two particularly problematic examples, the Plague of Justinian and the Black Death. We'll then finish our talk with an examination of the Great Influenza of 1918 to 1919 and the work undertaken by my team and I to create an authentic and respectful memorialization. But before all of that, I invite you now to relax, and I'm going to relax, clear your minds, and imagine yourselves in the 18th century on the northeastern frontier of North America. On a cold January day in 1737, Samuel and Sarah Hazen of Rowley, Massachusetts, a small town tucked away in the northeast of New England, buried their son, Edward, eldest and the last of their 5 children. By the end of that winter, the throat distempers had profoundly devastated their hometown. Despite this, no surviving diary, sermon, or newspaper reflected that devastation. Young Edward died of what we now call diphtheria. Its debut in the 18th century New England woods was the start of a sustained global run, one which remains an endemic threat worldwide today. My work, recovering the story of the Hazens and those of thousands of other families, has required a painstaking reconstruction, synthesizing hundreds of thousands of genealogical records from across the region. Combining these records with what we now know of the disease has yielded significant insights into the likely physical and emotional experiences of these tragic victims. For example, we can suppose 12-year-old Edward might well have spent much of his final 6 weeks helping his parents care for his dying brothers and sisters. First to die was his younger brother, Samuel. Almost 11 years old, Samuel would doubtless have already been exposed to numerous diseases, perhaps fighting off a few himself. The movements of humans and microbes back and forth across the Atlantic, maintaining a host of potential pathogens. After Samuel's passing, Samuel Sr. and his wife, Sarah, did what most of their fellow New Englanders would have done. While grieving for their lost child, they conceived another who would be born in August the following year, long after the distempers had carried off all their children. Samuel's death, while certainly a tragedy, was not in itself unusual, though. Many New England parents at the time experienced the loss of 1 or 2 children in their lives. The genealogical records make clear, however, that nothing in the prior experience of these or any other New England families could prepare them for what came next. The nearest parallel had been the Great Dying among the indigenous Massachusetts people following first sustained contact with Europeans in 1619. Towards the end of that December, just as life was returning to normal, 5-year-old Sarah and 6-year-old Margaret each contracted a similar but far more virulent distemper than that which had apparently taken their older brother. Each soon perished. What's more, as these 2 poor girls were succumbing to the disease, 3-year-old Benjamin, the youngest, and Edward would have started showing their same symptoms. Within a 3-week period, the last of Samuel and Sarah's children had died, leaving them an empty, quiet home. Quiet, not only for the loss of voices forever silenced, but to us as well. We find this silent dearth of reaction echoed, as it were, in the archives as well, making it doubly difficult to overcome. The mysterious throat distempers never achieved the notoriety of other classic diseases of the colonial era, like smallpox or measles, despite no single epidemic of the period having proved deadlier to European settlers. Gleaned from church and town records across the region from the 30 years following their 1735 appearance in what was then the wooded New Hampshire interior, the death toll we can safely ascribe to the throat distempers exceeded 10,000 individuals, from a population of over 200,000. At least 90% of the dead were also under the age of 20. In contradistinction to the distemper's extreme and dramatically skewed mortality rate, their persistence in the region, and the particular concentration of loss within a single generation, no in-depth modern historical study has fully investigated this strange disease. A doctoral dissertation rectified this lacuna and called on us to recognize something which should deeply trouble both professional historians and the public. If we assume that events of high lethality should leave discernible impacts on the cultures and societies afflicted, it is all the more remarkable to find so little trace of this new disease in the extensive literature concerning this famous period and locale. How has something so significant gone so unnoticed, especially in New England during the First Great Awakening? Could it be that it just wasn't that significant? Well, clearly it was. The above graph represents deaths reported per year for the Hazens Quiet Town, a town peculiar only in how typical it was of its milieu. The first year, 1641, falls a decade after settlement, and the last brings us close to the present day with a crude death rate for 2019. 2020 is not out yet. The peak above 1736 and 37 speaks for itself. From the beginning of European settlement in Raleigh, no epidemic came close or would come close to the sort of mortality seen in those years. 181 of 190 dead reported in 1736 were under the age of 20, representing the termination of over 70% of the town's youth in a single year. Even counting for new births from 1736 to 1740, further deaths in Raleigh over the next 3 years would bring the total youth lost to 80% of those who'd been alive in the spring of 1735. So from this single graph, we can see that something obviously happened, something truly awful. That same something also befell dozens of other towns across northeastern New England. But what about those classic diseases, right? Surely we might ask if the throat distempers, they may have been, awful, but what of smallpox? Wasn't that a deadly pandemic, ravaging across Britain's 18th century colonies, just as it was endemic here at home? Where did they stand in comparison, you might ask? Well, as you can see, there's really no comparison. The deaths ascribable to smallpox during even its worst appearances in the 1720s and 1770s are negligible in comparison, and were negligible in comparison throughout the area, throughout the whole region. If we take a moving average for the prior 10 years mortality as a baseline, the two smallpox visitations, while inarguably more legible, still pale beside the throat distempers. But what then of the smallpox? If these visitations were events of relatively low lethality, why do they seem to have left such a disproportionate impact on towns like Raleigh? Important enough of an impact to motivate establishing separate burial grounds for its victims. So again, separate burial grounds for smallpox victims in a small town in New England, but not for the throat distempers. Well, there's a reason. I have to have a reason, right? Smallpox is sexy. That's about it. The ubiquity of studies like these correlate not to the severity of the disease, but to our fascination with a story wherein we find a victim, a villain, and a victory against the masses, willful ignorance by brave and maybe to our eyes modern scientists. Stories, not diseases themselves, nor even the deaths they wrought, forge epidemics' cultural impacts. And the cultural impact of smallpox was truly extreme. Now, those same controversies over inoculation rage both in New England and here in the mother country. When an epidemic of smallpox arrived, though, in Boston in 1721, the Reverend Cotton Mather attempted to encourage the new practice of inoculation, a practice he had read about in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, and also confirmed by his enslaved African servant named only to us Onesimus. Opposing Mather was William Douglas, then Boston's only university-educated physician, whose professional reservations about inoculation echoed through to the present. Mather and his associates had no formal medical background and were contemplating experimenting using human subjects, children in fact, without the approval, let alone supervision, of better trained professionals. Furthermore, we may note that Douglas, as a physician arguing against inoculation, and Mather, a clergyman, arguing for inoculation, must at the very least complicate our assumptions about proto-scientific progress and the relations between science and religion more generally. Although the new practice's popularity grew, it also met resistance throughout the region. The decision to inoculate voluntarily to induce a minor smallpox infection to avoid a more devastating infection later rankled as many minds as it granted hope. In one famous example, on November 14th, 1721, an angry Bostonian threw a lit grenade, which thankfully did not explode, through Cotton Mather's window with an attached note, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you, I'll inoculate you with this, with pox to you." So, wow. I mean, I don't know why he put a note on a grenade. It seems a little odd. Maybe he knew it wasn't going, I don't know. But what, may you ask, does this have to do with pandemics, right? Everything, because it was not the death toll suffered by the victims of smallpox, but the struggle to eradicate a disease, the sheer human struggle against nature, a struggle also, as we've seen, against ignorance and fear, which created its legacy and continues selling books to this day. And this struggle was victorious, although it began centuries before the CDC, declared that victory in the late 20th century. Contemporaries feared smallpox, to be sure, but for many, it was not their greatest fear. Another disease held that distinction. And for that, we can look to a headliner of the founding generation, Abigail Adams. More than the wife of our second president, she was the intellectual as well as marital partner of her husband, John, contributing perhaps as much to the founding laws and ideas of the United States as any Thomas Jefferson or Benjamin Franklin, and eventually receiving respect reflected through a title of power, Mrs. President, if an informal one. No, it was, yeah, very informal. It is in the letters, though, that Abigail wrote to her husband from Massachusetts while he and his co-conspirators were orchestrating the revolution from Philadelphia that we find some of the most compelling evidence of the relative misplacement of smallpox in our collective memory. On Sunday, September 10th, 1775, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John in Philadelphia, lamenting on the throat distemper. "Patty is very bad. We cannot keep anything down that she takes. Her situation is very dangerous. Mr. Trott and one of his children are taken with the disorder. The smallpox in the natural way was never more mortal than this distemper has proven in this and many neighboring towns. 18 have been buried since you left us. Mr. Weld's parish, 4, 3, 2 funerals in a day for many days. Hitherto our family has been greatly favored. Heaven still preserve us." A month later, Abigail offered an update. "We still have great sickness yet in the town. Patty made the 4th corpse that was this day committed to the ground. But blessed be the Father of mercies, all our family are now well. I might have been stripped of my children as many others have been." Revolutionary Americans had no power over nature in the face of diphtheria, the throat distempers. Not the kind which they had against smallpox, the story of which is undeniably about that power over nature. And that power is as easily directed towards New Englanders as away from them. Such as when a combination of my own ancestors, the habitants of Quebec, and the British troops, perhaps some of your own forebears, successfully held back an invasion of American revolutionaries in the winter of 1775. The Canadians could do so because the American Continentals were racked with smallpox, and the North Americans feared inoculation while British troops had reached adulthood in a land where smallpox was already endemic. And it was upon this defeat that our very own George Washington reflected 2 years later in the darkest hours of the Revolution, when the British had taken the rebel capital of Philadelphia and forced Washington's retreat to nearby Valley Forge. Knowing he could not face the depletion of more troops to smallpox, he compelled his army to face their fears. In a letter to the chief physician of the Continental Army, Washington writes, "Finding the smallpox to be spreading much and fearing that no precaution can prevent it from running through the whole of our army, I have determined that the troops shall be inoculated. This expedient may be attended with some inconveniences and some disadvantages, but yet I trust in its consequences will have the most happy effects. Necessity not only authorizes but seems to require the measure. For should the disorder infect the army in the natural way and rage with its usual virulence, we should have no more to dread from it than from the sword of the enemy. We should have more to dread of it than from the sword of the enemy." My apologies. We might take a short moment to consider the power dynamics at work in another disease, one predating smallpox, inextricably linked to war, and with a legacy that lasts to the present. Now, some of you may know the English term smallpox was coined to set this disease apart from the pre-existing Great Pox, or syphilis, a disease that came from the Americas to Europe in the 15th century, then carried by troops across a war-torn continent. It was the perfect storm for a new venereal disease. Men moved from town to town, killing other men and leaving women destitute, often forced into sex work to support their families. Well, it may be hard to think of syphilis as a pandemic, and it was. It is the manner by which it persisted in the memory of past societies that concerns us here. Occurring as it did within a radically patriarchal society, men were often seen as potential young warriors, right? And always the victims, not the women they used or abused. Women were always the villain, and the disease often taking on a countenance of death in art, as we shall see, is always behind the mask of a woman. So, here we see a young man of both marrying and military age, kneeling before a masked woman. Now, behind that mask, you can see the classic death's head, and behind her sitting figures the scythe and cloak of the Reaper. What's more, we have a little joke going on here. Above the woman hiding in fear are Cupids, right? Venus's attendants. On the top left is Mercury. Stop me if you've heard this one. And there's a relevance. Mercury was used in what was believed to be the only somewhat effective treatment for syphilis, giving rise to the saying, an evening with Venus gets you a lifetime with Mercury. So here again, we see the same theme, death, hiding, and doing so in association with women. The woman to the left holding out a flower while concealing an asp, the real Cleopatra there, and the woman to the right holding a skull over her sexual organs. And of course, this all culminated in the ubiquitous VD posters of World War II. I mean, yeah, it's clearly her fault, right? So if smallpox was not one of the greatest killers in history, with diseases like diphtheria keeping people up at night, and others like the Great Pox assuming a sinister role in the public imagination, what are we to think about past diseases? Well, we certainly need to consider our sources and reevaluate our assumptions. To help us sort through the rest of the talk, and I had to put the footnotes in here, and I'll tell you why. It may be helpful to review just what the worst pandemics in history may have been. For our purposes, I'll define a pandemic as the appearance of an unexpected and massive increase of a particular disease on a global scale. While smallpox was endemic in 18th century England and thus not a pandemic, its appearances in North, Central, and South America in the 1770s do allow that qualification. Now, here are the top 5, smallpox noticeably absent. And I don't know if you can read this. Maybe some of you at home can read this. We must do our best to detail what these, where we're getting these numbers, and that's going to be a problem, but I'll talk about that in a second. So number 1, the Black Death, kind of an obvious one for us. Number 2, the Great Influenza. Number 3, at the moment, number 3, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which we are still in. The Plague of Justinian with 25 million. Gosh, that seems amazing back then to get a number like that. And COVID-19, of course, where as almost 7 million deaths as of March 2023. So just how reliable are these numbers? Again, I mentioned, trying to put the footnotes in here. We have to be very clear on these. I think number 4, though, gives us a perfect opportunity to see just how flawed our memory of past pandemics can be and how memories of different pandemics may bleed into each other. So this record is where almost all of our understanding of Justinian's plague comes from. This is from the Secret History of Procopius. Most especially, this is where our estimation of numbers comes from. During this time, there was a pestilence by which the whole human race came near to being annihilated. It embraced the entire world, blighted the lives of all men, though differing from one another in the most marked degree, respecting neither sex nor age. Now, the disease in Byzantium ran a course of 4 months, and its greatest virulence lasted about 3. And at first the deaths were a little more than the normal, then the mortality rose still higher, and afterwards the tale of dead reached 5,000 each day, and again it even came to 10,000 and still more than that. Now, if we break down this statement and graph the claim, we get a little closer to our problem, and forgive the cartoonish slide coming up here. So first we have our graph, right? 4 months across with an inner 3-month period there of the greatest virulence, right? It begins with deaths that were slightly more than normal, right? And the mortality rose still higher. And afterwards, the tale of dead reached 5,000 a day. Finally, it even came to 10,000 and still more than that. This gives us a perfect bell curve, right, from which to extrapolate over a region. And gosh, we all love a bell curve. While this is a rather imaginative way to calculate these deaths, it requires one to extrapolate over a region that's population, let alone its density distribution, we're completely unaware of, right? And of course, how do we even know that Procopius was telling the truth, right? So this beautifully titled PNAS article, The Justinianic Plague, an Inconsequential Pandemic, you know where they're going, by Mordecai et al. Sums up the issue very well. Late antique plague narratives are complex literary accounts with multiple layers of rhetorical meaning. Their authors had political, ideological, and personal purposes for their writing, and the text contains significant biases that must be contextualized. An account of a catastrophic plague could reflect reality, or could be a gross exaggeration employed to underscore a particular point. They go on to conclude, we have no more basis for the current maximalist estimate of 50% demographic loss than we would have for a minimalist estimate of 0.1%. Late antique plague mortality was spatially uneven, as plague ecology and epidemiology dictates. Some regions may have suffered higher mortality at certain times, such as Constantinople during the first outbreak, but it cannot be assumed all did. So this clarifies a major difficulty unique to the plague of Justinian. It is our memory of another plague, the Black Death, which clouds our perception here. Now, there's certainly very little reason to doubt the demographic impact of the Black Death, and it was, of course, truly astounding. If one takes a reliable population estimate of 80 million for pre-Black Death Europe against the most accurate and up-to-date claim of mortality, 65%, thank you, Ole Benedicto, for that, if you're watching, we get a death total of 52 million. And if we conservatively double this to include the populations of Asia and North Africa, we might easily estimate plague's total mortality at least 100 million, making its legacy not just the deaths of its victims, but of death in general. It is, after all, the plague, right? And saying it in those terms needs little clarification. But the other major plague pandemics, the Justinian plague of the 6th century and the third plague epidemic in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were no way equal in devastation, if perhaps arising from a similar agent, Yersinia pestis. And to be sure, there are many other horrors and legacies of the Black Death, which last to this day. There's the horror of pogroms, as you see depicted in this painting, of the 1349 St. Valentine's Day massacre, where 2,000 people of Jewish faith in Strasbourg lost their lives in a single day. There are others, like the abandoned medieval villages of Hamsey or Wick, but there were also innovations in public health policy that, among so many other effects of this most horrible of pandemics, remain as lessons for us today, like the quarantines of Ragusa and Venice, or the compassion of leaders of Pistoia who banned the sound of bells so that they might not depress or the infirm nor cause fear to arise in them. But it remains the overall magnitude of deaths, death without apparent cause that remains the legacy of the Black Death. Now, at last, we can turn to our final example. Certainly not the final pandemic before our latest. That honor goes to HIV, possibly the third most deadly, maybe the second most deadliest pandemic in human history. Instead, we're going to look at the Great Influenza of 1918 to 1919. After presenting this pandemic and the peculiarities of its legacy, I'll present a model for the memorialization that I and my colleagues, both here in the UK and home in the US, put together 4 years ago. But first, the flu. The so-called Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919 was named not to denigrate the Spanish, but reflective of the first appearance of news about the disease from their uniquely free press, publishing as it did in a neutral country. It was a short-lived pandemic as well, lasting barely a year. And while there are many theories as to its origin at that time, with China, England, and France offered as possibilities, the most likely candidate seems to have been my own country across the Atlantic. It seems to have arisen during the final year of World War I in March 1918 at Camp Funston, an army camp in Kansas pictured here. Apologies. Thereafter, the movement of millions of troops and civilians helped influenza the spread from the US quickly to every continent except Antarctica. It was far more virulent than the seasonal flu. People grew ill very quickly, and secondary infections, mostly bacterial pneumonia, combined with the flu, caused most of the deaths. It quickly became one of the most deadly disease outbreaks in world history. Global estimates of death range from 20 to 50, but maybe as many as 100 million, with up to 25% of the US population alone infected and about 675,000 dying of related conditions. Astonishing figures at a time when infectious disease deaths were supposed to be declining because of advances in medical knowledge and public health practices. For those out there who know what I'm talking about, please see Thomas McEwen here for the counter argument. Now, in Philadelphia, where I live and work, 1/4 of the 2 million residents became infected. From our count of death certificates, at least 17,500 died from the fall of 1918 through the following spring. Nearly 14,000 of those dying within a 6-week period between late September and early November. More than one death every 5 minutes. And why was the flu so bad in Philadelphia? Well, partly because of this event. Talk about your super spreader. There was a massive parade for the Liberty Loan Drive on September 28, 1918, to urge people to buy government bonds to support the U.S. involvement in World War I. About 200,000 people came to the city center to watch the parade, while just about a week before 600 sailors from a ship in Boston had been reported ill at the Navy Yard. And the first civilian cases had appeared already in the city. Now, despite some warnings from doctors, the parade went on. That pressure to meet fundraising goals was pretty tremendous at the time. The parade, though, was a key factor in spreading the flu in Philadelphia, along with other patriotic events, overcrowded housing conditions, poor sanitation, and inadequate and slow government response. And this medical crisis precipitated a burial crisis. On an average day in 1918, while there were about 50 to 70 deaths in Philadelphia, there were about 50 to 70 deaths in Philadelphia, with hundreds dying every day at the height of the pandemic in October of 1918, undertakers and cemeteries simply could not keep up. Caskets and bodies piled up all over the city. Years later, survivors recall being surrounded by dead bodies as one of the worst experiences of the pandemic. But what of its legacy? How did Americans respond to this horrifying death toll? A catastrophe seen and felt around the world, but one particularly devastating to the United States. For that, there's no better one to speak about this than our greatest flu historian, Alfred Crosby. In the years after the influenza, Congress made no special appropriation for influenza research whatsoever. Appropriations for the United States Public Health Service continued to rise steadily in line with population growth and slowly increasing consciousness of the importance of public health. But the pandemic did not stimulate a spectacular increase in these funds. In the 1920s, public and private expenditures on medical research in general were barely 1/50th of what they would become after World War II. The government and people ignored influenza in the 1920s as they ignored it to an amazing extent in 1918. If America wasn't awed by the Spanish flu in person, it certainly wasn't going to be by its memory. The Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, 1919 to 1921, has 13 inches of column space devoted to citations of articles about baseball, 20 inches of citations devoted to articles about Bolshevism, 47 to prohibition, and 8 to the flu. Now, as the centennial anniversary of the pandemic approached, my colleagues and I wanted to look back on the event, but with a sensitivity to individual lives that are often forgotten in such retrospectives. Yes, we would mention the Great War, but it couldn't be about war. Yeah, we would mention the state of medical care, but it couldn't be about medicine. Instead, we would take what I've called the pointillist approach that I used in my past work. The process that facilitated the insights into individual lives, like those of the Hazens with whom we began this talk, and aggregated together the insights into the magnitude of deaths, such as we found in our graph of Rowley's battle with diphtheria. Using an exhibit to memorialize those lost in our city from the ground up, based not on anecdotes, but on data, on the death certificates of 30,000 Philadelphians who died between August 1st, 1918 and March 1st, 1919, giving us the best picture we could produce, and not just of deaths, but of the lives lived and amid all these deaths. It would be about deaths led by death certificates. Now, these two here are but examples of over the 30,000 certificates that we transcribed and analyzed. They are exemplars of the lost. The majority of flu victims were between the ages of 18 and 35, cut down in the prime of their life by the health of their own immune systems. The flu setting off a cytokine storm resulting in inflammation and opening up the lungs to fatal secondary infections. Almost all victims are listed as dying of pneumonia. The first certificate to the left is for Eliza Boney. Born in North Carolina, Eliza followed the Great Migration, a movement of African American people to the northern U.S. in an effort to escape the horrors of life in the Jim Crow South. Eliza died October 15th, 1918, of influenza and pneumonia. She was 19 years, 8 months old, married, and in the early stages of pregnancy. Her story, in fact, has led to new research, and I and a colleague, Dr. Naomi Rendina of Case Western University, have undertaken research that tracks the impact of influenza on birth outcomes and maternal mortality. So, look for that. The second certificate is an exemplar on many grounds. Antonio Clerici was a 29-year-old carpenter born in Italy who also died on October 15th, 1918, of pneumonia following influenza. Now, Catholic immigrants to Philadelphia made up 75% of those killed by the influenza, and while Antonio was buried in the city's Potter's Field, the majority of those who died were buried in mass graves in just 2 of the city's Catholic cemeteries, Holy Cross and Holy Sepulchre. You might also notice that the certificate was not issued until 1922. The sheer amount of deaths backlogged the already overtaxed bureaucracies, with deaths taking years, sometimes decades, to account for. Now, stories like those of Eliza and Antonio guided the design and content of our exhibit space seen here, which opened on October of 2019 and will run through the end of 2024. I'll spend some time on 2 parts of that exhibit, but I want to tell you first about a particular public outreach event that led up to the event. Outreach that included a memorial reenactment of that parade. Participants walked a 3-mile route up Broad Street, Philadelphia's main artery, to City Hall, where a celebration was held long into the night. From the start, half of the participants were issued poster board cutouts with the name in bold of a person who died of the worst day of the pandemic's appearance, October 12, 1918. On the reverse, we printed a copy of the certificate so that individuals could read about the person to which they were signed as they walked. At various times along the way, those participants would enter between two lit white panels seen on the right, and there they would read the name aloud, a moving space designed to recreate the effect of optic nerve inflammation reported by the survivors that gave them a washed out vision of the world. Those without such panels played music specifically created for their event on their smartphones. Oscar-nominated composer David Lang creating a score called Protect Yourself from Infection, sung by the Grammy-winning Philadelphia choir, The Crossing. The lyrics were a Gregorian chant-inspired list of the names of the dead over and over again. And I want to give a shout out to Blast Theory for doing an amazing job putting this together. It was a pleasure working with them, and I hope I continue to work with people from England. It was great. And there are, of course, many ways now that these points, these death certificates, these little points inform our interpretation within the exhibit. As we wrap up, I want to tell you briefly about just two of them: see the spread and explore the epidemic. Now, this part of the exhibit was one of our many interactive stations. And in a stroke of luck, considering COVID hit just months after our opening, one that could also be accessed online. See the spread participants watched as a graph similar to what you saw with Rowley rose and fell over time, accompanying the spread of deaths across the city in the heat map to the right. Participants could adjust for demographic characteristics as well, isolating by age, race, ethnicity, etc. The next touchscreen, Explore the Epidemic, sat round the corner from See the Spread, and there visitors had the chance to explore the 4 worst hit neighborhoods in detail, down to the very city block and house level. There they could find photos of the people most affected, images of their homes, sites of emergency hospitals and cemeteries, and of course, stories from the pandemic. Participants could even search by a family name, a map not just of death, but of life in a living city. Now, our exhibit was and remains a success, not only winning 2 of the more prestigious awards in our field, but by giving people who, unbeknownst to us at the beginning, would be suffering through a pandemic of their own, a chance not to learn some fabricated lesson from the past. Not learning from the past to not make mistakes, but learning from the past to empathize with those who suffered as they now did. Earlier, I asked us to consider a predicament. If we assume that events of high lethality should leave discernible impacts on the cultures and societies afflicted, how remarkable to have found so little memory of diseases like diphtheria and the Spanish flu, and such a greater focus on less lethal diseases like smallpox and smallpox that dominate the Luray record, or the Plague of Justinian, whose death numbers may be at best an oversight and at worst an illusion. So here, as we approach the task of creating a memory of our own pandemic, what shall we do? In some ways, we've already started using the tools I presented for recovery of diphtheria and influenza victims. On January 22nd, 2020, the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center began publicly tracking pandemic data in near real time with the COVID-19 dashboard. By a wild coincidence, my course, The History of Pandemics, started 5 days later. I took this dashboard and introduced it to my students, and each week we would watch as this strange new illness spread across the globe. As this project evolved into the go-to hub, on March 3rd, 2020, Hopkins expanded the site recognizable as, quote, a comprehensible collection of raw data and independent experts analysis, now known as the Coronavirus Research Center. A month later, on April 8th, 2020, my students were watching this dashboard and this slide from our homes, zooming into class in our pajamas. But now, this tool has disappeared just a few days ago. The dashboard announcing the following message just last Friday, March 10th. After 3 years of 24/7 operations, the CRC is ceasing its data collection efforts due to an increasing number of US states slowing their reporting cadences. From the start, this should have been provided by the US government. This does not mean Johns Hopkins believes the pandemic is over. It is not. So, what will we do when the points, be they individual death records or tiny red dots, are gone? What will be the legacy of COVID? I certainly hope it's not going to be legislation such as this. Hateful, willful ignorance, and a desire to forget that goes so far as to step into law. I guess we'll have to see. After all, I'm a historian, not a prophet. But I do hope we'll take this opportunity to correct our warped lenses. We're not just individuals with individual perspectives, but a massive population of individuals, 7 million of whom died, some intubated, seeing their families for the last time over cell phones, some of whom had to pile bodies into refrigerated trucks. Will we remember our heroes, our saviors? Will we change the channel, swipe to the next post, or mock those frightened, traumatized among us who cling to their masks and sanitizer because they remind them of something we all want to forget? Will we continue to elect leaders who mocked our science or threw parties while Uber drivers and grocery clerks faced death so that we could eat? And what of those who stayed home, masked up, kept their distance, zoomed goodbye to friends, family, and lovers before they breathed their last? Can they be our heroes? Can we count them in our history? Can they be our points? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Nick. That was absolutely fascinating, and you traversed such a wide range from the time of Justinian down to COVID, with so many points in between. There's an awful lot there for us to think about and to absorb. Nick, you happy to take a few questions?
I would love to.
Yeah. And are we taking online comments as well?
In fact, we have a question that's come up already.
Okay, let's start with that, and I'll leave others to think about their questions.
It's a comment on smallpox figures.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just scrolling back higher to get. So one of our attendees online states, the American Museum of Natural History and other internet sources give the estimate of smallpox deaths to be 300 million since 1900 alone.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it that their estimate is so high compared to yours?
Well, I didn't give you my estimate for smallpox deaths over a long period of time. I cannot speak to that. What I was looking at is its appearance in North America, and I was looking at its appearance in a particular region. In places like, for instance, I mean, we can go all the way back to look at John Grant's figures, right? The sort of at the birth of demographics with his natural and political observations. Smallpox shows up even there. It's a constant killer in England. It's a constant killer in Europe, right? And it's what we would call an endemic disease, right? It's something that is always there, will always be there. And there's actually, there's great work being done here on campus. Erica Charters, I believe, is doing some work on how epidemics end. And there we're looking at the difference between a sort of pandemic state in certain areas and the endemic state in others. So while, of course, for those that don't know, when we have an epidemic, really it comes down to are we seeing observed numbers that are more than what we expect? And that's where we declare something an epidemic. On the other hand, anytime you get a nice round number like that, 300 million, is rather difficult to face. But billions of people have died over time. Everybody dies of something. It's a binary, right? So when we're thinking about pandemics, we also have to make the decision of, where are we going to sort of pull these things out from each other? Where are we going to call something an epidemic or a pandemic? And where are we going to say this is just normal? And yeah, we're all going through that right now, right? Worldwide, I think there are roughly about 700 deaths per day of COVID, roughly about 300 to 400 of those in the United States. So are we in an endemic stage? I think many people would say yes. Go see Anthony Fauci for those numbers. No, sorry, still love Anthony. Yeah. Go ahead.
there are questions in the room. At the back there.
You talked about absolute numbers of deaths in your top 5. How do they relate to percentage of the population is affected as opposed to absolute numbers?
Right. Very difficult to say. I think Ole Benedicto has gotten a lot of press over the years. He's a historian of the Black Death, for example, who has done what nobody really else wants to do, to try and write a sort of complete history. It can't be done, but he's the one who's come closest to it. So there was just a reissue of this huge tome that all of us who do disease studies have to read through. But one of his great triumphs has been constantly reevaluating what population levels were like in the earlier part of the 14th century, controlling for the famines and the wars that were taking place at the same time, and then coming up with, based on aggregating different death counts in different places, coming up with that 65%, which has been moving up over the years. And against a lot of caution, there's an awful lot of evidence that suggests it was more than 65%. And even about 10 years ago, we'd be hesitant to say 60, but that same evidence is kind of pulling it forward. Now, in terms of percentages for others, it's difficult to say. The numbers for influenza and the numbers for HIV come out of the CDC, and the WHO, which are again aggregating things themselves. But they seem a little bit more based on, actual vital records and reporting along those lines. They're a little more secure. But I don't. And that, if I do this again, I do want to see where I could put those percentages in. But again, it does raise the problem of where do we see deaths, right? So diphtheria, if New England was its beginning, and I know there's arguments for Spain and some other places, but it seems that New England is where it first shows up, spreads across the Atlantic, and eventually Samuel Bard, and eventually, Pierre Bretonneau will call it diphtheria, right? But there, it's happening in the exterior, right? It's not happening in Boston. It's not happening in Salem. It's not happening in New York until much later. And it may be that we think it may be something to do with the presence of a certain bacteriophage and whether or not there's enough iron in the environment. So there may be contributing factors, but again, these are incredibly high death tolls in areas that are far away from where the press is, right? Far away from our sort of centers of culture as well. So those percentages can also be a little skewed as well, right? And there are epidemics and pandemics that decimated and were terrible for smaller communities, right? We can't imagine what it was like to be somebody in West Africa when Ebola was in the news. But certainly a percentage, global percentage would tell us nothing about Ebola. It's really getting down and getting the stories of people. And for instance, I would suggest you go to the Welcome. They have a wonderful new sort of room where there's a full outfit of a woman who was a nurse during the Ebola outbreaks, who was kicked out of her home by her landlord. Really, I mean, those are the kind of stories you want to get at. So again, those percentages can be a little off.
Yeah, so as these pandemics become more and more international, how do we approach a more all the different countries and different responses created such different experiences?
Oh my God, yes. And another American. Good. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we've got many reasons to want to be at the forefront of those questions in our country. We're trying to do something with it. I think the Black Death is a great example of this, right? We are only beginning to get an idea of what the damage was like in China, right? And one of the theories is that it sort of sprang up in what we would call today, in sort of what the areas of sort of eastern China today, and spread along the Silk Road, along these trade routes, right? Trade routes that were expanded by sort of the Mongol hordes in the century before. Things like the decimation of Baghdad would have maybe contributed to sort of, changing around some of those trade routes as well, making it a little more complicated. But my God, the effect of the Black Death on the Hajj, right? I mean, these are things that we want to know about, right? And they are starting to come into the literature. Oddly though, with the third plague pandemic, right, which is roughly 19th century, it hits San Francisco a little bit. It's ignored, right? There are pandemics out there that we don't know about. And there may be things that we could call pandemics, right? Although we don't have a specific disease, the death of so many indigenous peoples in North America, Central America, the Caribbean, South America, after contact with Europeans, while we can't identify a particular disease, and new research, probably not smallpox. We could talk about that another time. But there was a lot of death. And we don't need to call it smallpox. We don't need to call it measles. We could just say there was a lot of death there and follow that as an epidemiologist would, looking at the effect of a disease in a population. So I don't know. Maybe we can find something. The hope is there. The dream is there. And as our academy becomes more open and diverse, I hope those will arrive.
We have another couple of comments on the chat.
Do feed them.
Okay. So, firstly, Naomi is online and says thank you very much for the shout out.
All right, thank you, Naomi.
So there's a comment here about the fact that TB surely was one of the world's most infectious diseases, killed more than diphtheria, and appears to be forgotten just as much as.
And another one that really creeps into our cultural memory in a great way, the White Plague. I think Charles Rosenberg, the great, probably our best living historian of disease. I don't know. I kind of think it's my advisor, Chris Hamlin, but hey, wrote a line that, if I remember this correctly, cholera was the classic disease of the 19th century, right? And he goes on to say it wasn't because it was the deadliest disease of the 19th century. That would have been tuberculosis, right? But it was scary for people. It was associated with the poor. Cholera is something that you could be perfectly fine right now, and then, let's just say it. We all know what cholera is. You die of violent, diarrhea, right? So what more disturbing for a Victorian mind, right, than that sort of radical dehydration? Tuberculosis, on the other hand, was the sexy disease. Go down to the Ashmolean, go look at some of the pre-Raphaelites over there, the inspiration of the sort of waif, right? That back in the 90s, we used to call it the waif thing, or heroin chic, right? They were doing this 100 years back, right? Poets were wasting away from this wasting disease, right? We don't know how far back tuberculosis goes, but tuberculosis is something that there's an estimate that possibly 25% of Americans are carrying it. It's just dormant, right? So this disease is everywhere, right? But we can't pinpoint a beginning. We can't pinpoint an end. And it does seem, to a degree, and retrospective diagnosis is a very dangerous area to walk, a very dangerous road to walk down, but it seems to have been with us for quite some time. I am not one that suggests Galen had the same sort of set of pathogens that we have today. I've taken enough bio in my life to know how evolution works, but there is reason to think tuberculosis is one of the greatest killers of all time, if not the, right? But not a pandemic, right? Maybe, right? You could call it a pandemic if you want. I'm okay with that, right? I think we should all be able to do it. As long as you're not working in public health, do what you want. then if you're working in public health, we really got to agree on this kind of thing. But there has to be a beginning, there has to be an end. And that's another thing that Rosenberg brought up was this sort of, we expect that there's a dramaturgy around epidemics, right? There's going to be a beginning, it's going to reach a height, and it's going to eventually fade away. And there will be victims, and there will be heroes, and there will be some type of victory afterwards, right? And we walk off the stage and we move on with our lives. And it's a TV show that we saw and we liked it, or we saw and it made us cry, and we don't want to talk about it again, right? So, yeah, there's, I don't know, I think, I hate to say it like this, but I mean, we all love Star Wars, right? We wear Star Wars t-shirts. We want to remember Star Wars. There's not a lot of, but I mean, how much more wonderful, amazing, and beautiful a movie was Schindler's List, but none of us are wearing that t-shirt, right? And none of us want to. So, sorry, I hope that helps. That helps.
Great. And there's another one.
Indeed. So we have a comment from somebody who had visited the village of Naham in Derbyshire. Ian, sorry, thank you very much.
Oh my God, I love those accents down there.
Which in the 17th century, I think, deliberately isolated itself to limit the spread of the plague. And the visitor centre there declared that they are investigating the DNA of survivors in the hope that there might be useful clues regarding HIV immunity.
Mm-hmm.
Since COVID-19, is there ongoing research into survivors and their genes to see if we may usefully produce vaccines, having learnt from these survivors' DNA?
I don't know. That's the easy answer. The easy answer is I don't know. What I am involved with one of my projects, the Earthshoe project, is looking at the evolution of the co-evolution of pathogens with people. So we're looking at, how by isolating smallpox, by isolating proteins associated with yellow fever, we can think about how these particular diseases have changed over time. The pathogen, the agent itself. I think there may be something to this. If anybody, I don't know, checks me out online or something, I'm working on this project to try and sort of identify people in a cemetery that we found in Philadelphia. I mean, they're all under car parks, right? This is where everybody, if you want to find the dead, you look under a car park, apparently. Looking at something, the potential is there right now to use DNA. We have our DNA out there in these databases. Many of them are owned by banks. Scary thought. Whether we use those or not, though, is a decision I think researchers are going to have to think about, right? What are going to be the ethical issues of sort of looking into past DNA, right? We in the United States don't really have guidelines for dealing with the dead in the way that many other countries do, but we are taught either as young archaeologists, sometimes as young historians, some of us, as older historians, but is we have NAGPRA, the North American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and this was passed to protect the graves and grave-associated objects of our indigenous peoples, our First Nations in North America. That includes DNA, right? And there's a sense that maybe privacy is important here. So some of our ethics is moving away from DNA in some areas. So we get the funny example, we had the funny example of I'm a historian who has to think about internal review, IRBs, so lucky me, I don't know. So I don't know about the research into those isolated communities. I, of course, would love to read those articles when they came out. But there's a funny thing about quarantine. It doesn't work at all. It's never worked, right? You get a bunch of people that show up at a pest house, right, on a boat. It's not about keeping those people safe. It's about keeping everybody else safe from them, right? So if 40% of the people on a boat have plague, have smallpox, have yellow fever, that's a different story, right? That have some kind of illness and they're isolated, there's a chance a great deal more than 40% are going to die, right? Quarantines are a way to also get everybody else infected that's along with you as well. So those types of, sanitary borders, it's an interesting idea. I'd like to see how it works. I don't know what any long-term effect would be on that, but yeah, I don't know. That sounds like a different kind of evolution. But
great, we've got one, two more. There's one at the back, and then Andy. So let's take that one.
Thank you so much for your talk.
You're welcome.
Particularly your words at the end. Just wondering about your thoughts. This is most certainly going to happen again, maybe in our lifetimes, who knows? What do you think are the most important lessons that we need to take forward?
Global warming. Global warming. Global warming. Global warming. Right? I wanted to talk about HIV in this talk, but there's too much to say. And the history of HIV is the history of colonialism. It's the history of the breaking down and forced, the sort of almost forced civil war that was occurring, right, in Congo, where people were pushing into the bush, right, to set up to set up roads, to sell lumber, to sell anything they could to make money, so that they could either continue this war or just live, right, live hand to mouth. And over the past 50 years, we've seen an extraordinary rise in zoonotic diseases, one of those being HIV, right, coming from simian, so SIV, right? There are going to be more. And whether or not, right, we have, I think I just spoke about this with somebody yesterday, in fact, from one of your faculty here. I think there's whether or not, wherever COVID came from, COVID came either directly or indirectly as a result of these sort of incursions and these changes in environment. When we take animals out of where they are, right, and put them in proximity to humans is a problem, right? So global warming, right? It's also a problem for these endemic diseases that we have, right? I mentioned McCowan, right? Thomas McCowan, who is often bandied about by sort of, conservatives as well. We don't need public health, right? All we need to do is make people rich. And when they're rich, they won't have kids and they'll be happy. And gosh, oh yeah, that's right. This place was built on a workhouse, wasn't it? Right? Thomas McCown's, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? Right? I know that's Dickens, but, there's, so this kind of idea, do we want to, there's a reverse of McCowan that we don't pay attention to, right? That if people are losing money, if there's a greater disparity in wealth, right? Even McCowan's thesis turns on this, right? That we are going to see more disease, right? We are not going to be able to cure anything that's a fecal oral transmission. We're going to have problems with vector-driven diseases. And we're going to have, let's stop talking about infectious diseases, right? There's other diseases as well. So I don't know. I'm sorry. Global warming. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Andy, you have it.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I'd like to ask a question about the exhibition you did at Philadelphia on the influenza epidemic.
I would like to answer that question.
I was fascinated by that. It looked really interesting. I'd like to have been able to see it. Did the museum do any visitor evaluation, visitor experience evaluation? And what did they learn from what people got out of it?
Oh, you are asking the wrong person. We did a lot of this. In fact, we did it throughout the, we did it when we were first throwing the idea out there, right? So have you heard about the, Spanish flu? Have you heard about the Great Influenza? If you have and you haven't, I think there was something like 40% had or 60% maybe had heard something or nothing at all. And they wanted to know about it. And the things that they wanted to know were the things that we wanted to tell, which is always lovely in a survey, right? That, they wanted to know about the individual lives. They wanted to know about the way it affected average people like themselves. And that really kind of moved through the work that we did with the exhibit. It guided things. our head curator there, Jane Boyd, is the one who was really who knew, who knows all the figures on that. There's the curator of the Mutter Museum as well, Anna Doty, I think would have those numbers. So they're out there. Unfortunately, after doing years of transcriptions and like with and like wrangling cats, like what is it, herding cats? It's not like wrangling cats. Wrangling cats. Yeah, I had to take a break. So my eyes were going, and I had just done my my dissertation work at the same time. So there's with the hundreds of thousands of New Englanders, and there you go. And but I'm really into the New Englanders because my father's family is French Canadian, going all the way back to the 17th century, and I'm so curious why they want to kill us all the time. So I'm very interested in these angry Puritans. I know you had some angry Puritans over here. I think some of you have studied some of these, angry folks in the 17th century. They're fascinating. They're weird. Thank God for Charles II. And the third. Cheers. There you go. But yeah, sorry, I wish I had more data on that. I'm afraid I've done one of those things where I've answered a question that you didn't ask, but I will try and get you that if I can.
Great. Anyone else online?
I love these questions, so I'm enjoying this.
Anyone else in the room? One more.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question to that, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Now that we all have had individual experiences of COVID-19, do you see a move towards a greater appreciation of this pointillism approach versus the more big picture history, larger ambiguous approach?
A big yes and a big no, right? Yes, some of you may have been part of some of these efforts to really chronicle what happened, right? So many of us have gone to museums, or when we were online, kept online records of what we were doing. Just today I was at the, I think it was the History of Science Museum, and they were asking like, what new, hobby did you pick up, during COVID lockdown, right? These wonderful things are showing up everywhere. And my God, if we can figure out a way to actually hit print so that, digital data doesn't degrade in 30 years, it would be wonderful to have that. And I think, I see the effort coming in a way that looking back on HIV, I think we're starting to recognize, how much of a horrible, pandemic it really was, right? That, there are the beautiful, wonderful stories of things like, Larry Kramer and Anthony Fauci in public sort of, butting heads and act up like burning Fauci in effigy. Well, in the back, they're negotiating for like patient rights, right? And there's a lovely tribute Fauci gave to Kramer of, we wouldn't have had the innovation, we wouldn't have had the quick turnaround on vaccines if it wasn't for people like Kramer and ACT UP that were pushing for that. And that's a wonderful story to remember AIDS as and in some ways as a victory of people, a victory of activism, right? There were people like C. Everett Koop, who, even within the Reagan administration, sends out these letters talking about safe sex when, our president, Nancy Reagan, didn't want to have that. I meant that, Nancy Reagan. I said that again, Nancy Reagan, our president. No. So there's, but on the other hand, right, there are people that don't want this to be heard, that don't want to talk about this. The United States is not alone in these sort of, anti-masking ideas. It's not alone in this sort of new revisionism that's coming out. And I call it, I shudder when I say revisionism, because that's sort of a word that's used for what people like myself do, right? Where we try and take a record that's flawed, and we want to look back and we want to give a better picture of the past, right? We want to revise these sort of reductionist accounts. Others want to go back, it's sort of a re-revisionism, right? So is there a word that we can use to define COVID, right? We won the battle. Somebody won the battle. I don't know who. The WHO. Somebody needs somebody needs a cookie for COVID, right? Wow, a disease that doesn't denigrate a population or doesn't denigrate a particular location, right? I am so apologetic for my president at the time saying China flu, right? But people want it to be called that. There are people actively in my country looking to blame this on China, looking to see a disease not as the action of a global, united ecological community that is suffering together, right? They want to see it in terms of people doing things to them, people taking their tax money, people taking their land. And it's the worst kind of libertarianism. And I don't know. Oddly, we may lose, the sight of the individual by individualists who want to deny these things. So I don't know. Gosh, I should have been a priest. I'm sorry. But yeah, lot to say with these things.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think we're just about to the end of our session. So
time for a drink.
I'd like to thank Nick very much indeed for an absolutely fascinating lecture.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming across and from the States to be with us.
It's been wonderful.
We've got a chance to, go and have a drink and hopefully maybe carry on the discussion there as well.
Yeah.
In the meantime, let's give Nick a very big round of applause.
Well, thank you all for your great questions.